Mark chapter 14, I'm going to begin reading in verse 26. This is just after Jesus and his disciples had had their last meal together. They celebrated the Passover together. And now we have these words. Mark 14, beginning in verse 26. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, "You'll all become deserters, for it's written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though all become deserters, I will not." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said vehemently, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all of them said the same. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a 3rd time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. There's something about this moment that is causing Jesus to question everything that he has spent a lifetime believing. And I know it's easy to dismiss it because Jesus is God. Our confessions tell us that, and it's true. It was demonstrated by his resurrection from the dead. And yet, he struggles. What does it mean to be the people of God in the midst of life-altering moments that leave us a panic? What does it mean when we lose what we thought we were? What does it mean to hear God's voice? How do we hear it? Proverbs 17, verse 24 says this, "A discerning person keeps wisdom in view, but a fool's eyes wander to the ends of the earth." It seems that what is essential for Jesus in this moment, in which everything in his life is going to fall apart, one of his best friends, he's been with him for at least 3 years in the gospel, it could have been longer, 5, 6 years. He spent all of his time with these 12 guys. One of them is right then betraying him to people who want him dead. The other 10 of the other 11 who remained with him that night were going to fail him soon. And he knew that on the other side of his arrest and his trials was going to be the most torturous death that the Roman Empire had to that point in history invented. He was going to be crucified. This is quite a night for Jesus. How is he going to keep wisdom in view? The hardest time for us to keep our eye on the ball is when we are stressed, when we're anxious, when we are fearful. In those periods of time, we are in an instinctive fight or flight mode. Adrenaline, high blood pressure, all of those things. It depresses our ability to reason and to think. And if we think for a moment that Jesus wasn't in that kind of a moment, all we have to do is look at the gospel accounts of the things he says he was suffering. In the gospel, according to Luke, he was so feverishly in agony that he was either doing one of two things. The Greek is unclear. Either he had burst capillaries and he was literally bleeding out of his pores, or he was sweating so profusely that it looked like blood pouring from a wound. Either way, Jesus is in quite a moment. And for us, when we're in those moments, our instincts often take over, and it's hard, the old saying is, to see the forest for the trees. That's where Jesus is. And his disciples were headed. And their divergent responses in this moment is going to help us, I think, to understand what it means to keep wisdom in view in the midst of a world turning upside down. And so in the course of learning that, of discovering wisdom and discernment in the midst of intense anxiety, we're going to explore three aspects of this story with relation to Jesus. The first is Jesus' agitation. Second, Jesus' admonition. And third, Jesus' actions. So we're going to start with Jesus' agitation. Look at these verses. So it begins with this prediction that Peter is going to fail Jesus. And we need to have that in view because part of his failure begins right here in the garden. But really I want to pick up here in verse 32. It says, "Then they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he, Jesus, said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' He took with him Peter, James, and John, and then these words. He began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, 'I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake.'" It is so hard to adequately express the emotionality of these terms for Jesus. I'm just going to give you some places in Mark and then in the Bible where this word is used. In the Greek, the word translated deeply grieved. It was used earlier in the Gospel according to Mark, in chapter 6, verse 26. And it was describing the emotions of Herod when he had that party. Some of you remember the story. And his stepdaughter danced for him. And he was so enamored by it, he's a pretty lewd guy, that he promised her anything she asked in the kingdom. And she came to him and said, "I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Now he had arrested John the Baptist, but John the Baptist was widely recognized by the people as a prophet from God. And so he had arrested him, but he was not going to kill him because of what it would do to him. And can you imagine the moment when his daughter-in-law says to him, "I want his head," and he's just promised in front of all of his guests he'll do whatever she says. That emotion is what Jesus is describing. It's also used in the book of Genesis, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament book of Genesis, in chapter 4, verse 6, where the first two humans born after Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel. Cain is the elder brother, Abel is the younger brother, and they both bring sacrifices to God. And God loves Abel's sacrifice, but Cain's he doesn't like so much. And the feeling that Cain had in that moment is described by this word. He was deeply grieved. And of course, that feeling led him to murder his brother. This is an intensely emotional word. This is how Jesus describes his feelings to his friends. He comes to them and says, "I am so anxious. I feel like I'm going to die." Why? Why would Jesus feel that way? Is this just an act? Well, many have speculated. But I suspect, at least in Jesus' humanity, it was a combination of things. And I've already laid them out. I'll lay them out again. One of his 12 best earthly friends was right then betraying him to his enemies. 10 of the other 11 were going to abandon him that night, and he was going to be alone with only one of his 12 disciples sitting there. The people that he came to instruct and deliver and save, the very people that he had been working with and teaching and healing and instructing and ministering to, they that night were going to turn him over for execution. And before the sun set the next day, he would be executed in the most torturous way yet imagined by the Roman Empire. He would be crucified. And he was waiting there in that garden for all of that to happen. How is Jesus going to know God's will in that kind of a circumstance? And to add to it all, Jesus' agitation, I suspect, was that he knew full well what was coming and he could have avoided it. He wasn't surprised that Judas came. He knew it was coming. And yet he needed to know God's will in that moment. Do I stay and let this happen? Or do I leave and escape it? That was Jesus' agitation. So here's his admonition to his disciples. Verse 37, he says this. He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." I love this phrase, "the spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." It's so good in the Greek, because what he means is the wind is willing, but the body is weak. Meaning that your words are easy, but your behavior is something else. The wind is easy. The words are easy. but the flesh is weak. But notice what Jesus did not do. He did not ask them to pray for him. In the midst of his agitation, he did not ask his disciples to pray for him. He told them to pray for themselves, to pray that they would not have to enter into the space that he was entering. And he had already warned them about this. He had already warned them that they had to be ready when the time came. In Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 37, they were all worried about the end times and about what's going to happen when Jesus comes back. And Jesus won't tell them when he's coming back. He says he doesn't even know. But he tells them they have to be ready. They have to keep awake. They have to be doing the work of the kingdom. You notice the repetition of the phrase, keep awake? It's all over that passage and it's all over this one. He warned them not to be found sleeping when their master returned. They were to be busy with kingdom work, loving and living like Jesus, praying to their God when he came to them. And he did that very thing this night. He came to them. And he found them asleep. When the time of testing came, they failed to remain loyal to him. They failed to love him. They were not prepared. The stress of the moment made them lethargic. And they went to sleep. And stress, busyness, anxiety, they have ways of doing the same thing to us, keeping us from those things that would prepare us when the wheels fall off. If we spend our time and energy sowing to the wind, is the biblical phrase, casting our seeds into the air, putting our time and our energy and our resources into all kinds of things that can't sustain us when the storms come, we'll find ourselves helpless before the winds when they arrive. So Jesus was truly agitated. But in the midst of that agitation, he admonished his disciples to be ready, which tells us something about how Jesus prepared himself for that moment. We'll have to look here at Jesus' actions. Look at verse 35. These are the words Jesus prayed. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. And then in verse 39, after he speaks to his disciples, it says, and again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. See, Jesus, on the night before he died for us, he asked two things of God. He asked that God deliver him, but he also asked that God's will be done. But Jesus didn't pray that prayer, deliver me from my time of trial, but your will be done. He did not pray it after the soldiers came. He didn't pray it while they were crucifying him. He prayed it before. In fact, the gospel according to Mark says it had been Jesus' practice throughout his earthly ministry to go alone by himself and have these kinds of conversations with God. In the gospel according to Matthew, when his disciples asked, how should we pray? And he taught them how to pray. These are the words he told them to use. Our Father who is in the heavens, blessed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done. On earth as it is in the heavens. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive also our debtors. Lead us not into trial. It's the same word. Temptation. But deliver us from the evil one. You see, Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed and the wheels fell off, continued to do the exact same thing he had been doing his whole life. He prayed the same words with the same heart. Jesus was ready to do God's will on that night, no matter the cost, because he had already been doing God's will. And Jesus was also in a position to ask for God's deliverance because he had demonstrated with his life to this point that he was willing to do God's will first. He had already shown that he would say yes to what God asked of him. And I want to say this about this. I do not believe we can discern God's will in moments of stress and high anxiety if we have not been committed to his will in seasons of ease. It is the practices of Jesus' life prior to Gethsemane that made him able to hear God's voice in Gethsemane. In this moment of darkest night for Jesus, he discovered God's will and received the courage to endure this time of trial and to make his way to the cross, not because of the prayer he prayed that night, but because of the patterns of his life leading up to that night. Those things prepared him for what was needed. Proverbs 17:24 says, "A discerning person keeps wisdom in view, but a fool's eyes wander to the ends of the earth." If we are to keep wisdom in view, we must do it when wisdom is easy to see. Because when the clouds come and the storms rage and the terror is palpable, if we don't know what direction wisdom was in, we will not find it in the midst of the storm. It's the patterns of our everyday lives, the priorities of our daily and weekly schedules that either are preparing us to discern God's will in our moments of crisis or not. Jesus did nothing on that frightful night. This is the remarkable thing about Jesus. He did nothing on that frightful night that he had not been doing throughout his entire life. And when his life was literally on the line, the same patterns, the same practices brought him into the space of God's will. They did not deliver him from the moment, but they helped him to know what was right to do in it. There's an old saying that I love. It's this: when did Noah build the ark? Before the flood. The flood is coming for all of us. Whether it's our death at the end, whether it's sickness in the middle, whether it happens with our kids or our jobs, the flood is coming. We know that. So what are we doing to prepare? What needs to happen when our flood comes is not that we need to be wealthy or find a way to survive. It's not that we need to keep all the things we have. It's not that we need to make sure that life goes back to whatever it was for those 6 years when we were kids. What we need in the midst of the worst of things is to be faithful to Jesus. Because he is our only hope. What are you building? What are you building? Where do you spend your time? Where do you invest yourself? What does your weekly schedule look like for your family? What kind of a foundation is it establishing for them? This is what we learn from him. He had been practicing for that night his whole life. Little things, right? When he became popular, the temptation to be a king was there with him. When he fed 5,000 people in the wilderness, a lot of people probably would have set up a town there, named him the Almighty Savior, and given him all their money and resources, and he could have been wealthy, but he didn't do it. When he had to stand up in front of the Jewish leaders and he had to criticize what they were doing, and he knew what it was going to result in, he had the courage to do it, and to do God's will, not what was best for him. When he had to speak those hard words to his disciples and they withered from a group of hundreds to 70s down to 12 because they didn't like what he had to say, he kept saying it anyway. He had been doing this his whole life, following God's will no matter the cost. On this night he was ready. And this was the worst imaginable moment for Jesus. When did Noah build the ark? Before the flood. What are you building? Are you ready? If the worst happens tomorrow, are you ready? Ready to live through it. Ready to be faithful through it. Ready to be godly through it. Are you ready? Many of us, like Peter, would say, absolutely. I'm ready. And I think Jesus' response is, only if you've already been doing it. My point is that discipleship and holiness is a commitment to practice every day what we need when it matters. And Jesus evidenced that for us. And his disciples, they didn't get it, but they learn it on this night. When they find out how ill-prepared they were when the moment comes, they spend the rest of their life living very differently than they did up to this point with Jesus. This evening changes everything for them, not just because Jesus rose from the dead, but because they learned what it took to get to the cross for Jesus. And they realized the same preparations had to be part of their lives too. And the book of Acts shows us the choices they made after they learned this lesson. The Gospels show us who they were before they learned it. What are you building? Would you trust God in the little things so that you're ready when the wheels fall off? Are you ready?